What are the steps you have to take to use LINQ to SQL in a Windows application? Well, the first thing is to create your object model, and you're familiar with that by now. Open up the Server Explorer, drag tables onto the Object Relational Designer, and build your object model. Then in your Windows application, you're going to want to create data sources based on each of the entity classes in your model. And then you can use drag and drop data binding to bind controls on the form to data. Then you'll use submit changes, the method of the data context, to save any modified data, and you can use LINQ to SQL queries to retrieve additional information to display to the users. So it's going to be a combination of familiar techniques. LINQ to SQL, which is now familiar to you, and drag and drop data binding. What if you're creating a web application? Well, again, the first thing you'll need to do is create the object model. Then you can use the LINQ data source control to bind controls on web pages to data. And the LINQ data source control is a new control that ships as part of ASP.NET and Visual Studio 2008. And then you can use LINQ to SQL queries to retrieve additional information. The purpose of the LINQ data source control is to interact with the data context. So you're still going to have your object model, but the LINQ data source control is what connects your web pages to the actual data. So in that sense, it's just like the SQL data source or the object data source control. You can use declarative markup to retrieve data, work with data, and that includes updates. So for example, here, we're going to add a LINQ data source to a web page. We're going to call it products LINQ data source, and we're going to associate it with the Northwind data context. And we're going to say deleting, inserting, and updating are allowed, and this LINQ data source is going to be working with information in the products table. Then on that page we have a grid view 1, and the data source ID is set to products LINQ data source. So that grid's going to display products. We identify that the data key name is product ID, and then we can write code in the on-row canceling, edit, and on-row updated events. So let's go take a look at using LINQ to SQL in a Windows app and then in a web app. I have the LINQ to SQL Windows demo solution open, and this solution contains two projects. Windows Client is my Windows Forms application, and I have forms in there for working with customers and products and orders. And then Data Layer contains my object model, and that's called Northwind. And let's take a look at this. We have customer, order, order detail, product, supplier, and category, as well as stored procedures for adding, deleting, and updating customers. And then in data validation, I have code to validate orders. We saw this in the previous section. When I validate an order, and this is going to happen when I try and save changes. If I'm inserting, I'm going to check to make sure the order date's not before today. And whether I'm inserting or updating, I'm going to check that the required date is not before the order date. And then I don't want anybody to change the order date of an existing order, so I'll put that code in the on order date changing. I also have some validation code for product. I'm going to use the on created, and this code will run when I create a new instance of the product class. And I'm going to set discontinued to false. And the reason I'm going to do that is because in the Northwind database, in the products table, discontinued can't be null, and I've always found it just a tad extra work that when I create a new product, I have to then go down and make sure that that discontinued checkbox is not checked. I don't spend a lot of time adding products that are already discontinued, so I'm just going to set discontinued to false by default when I create a new product. And then in the onValidate, I'm going to make sure that the price is greater than 0, and I'm going to check the reorder level for expensive products, whether I'm inserting or updating. And then I'm also in the onUnitPrice changing going to make sure that the price is greater than 0. So I've put both of that, the object model and the data validation, in the data layer project. And then in the Windows Client project, I have my forms. So I have a customer form that displays customer information on the top and orders for that customer on the bottom. Let's call up the data sources. I have a data source for each entity in the object model. And the way I did that was I went to Add New Data Source, and I said I'm not talking directly to the database. I'm going through an object, and that object is my object model. That object model is in data layer, and I then created a data source for category, for customer, for order, for each of those. And then they appear in the data sources window. And what this gives me the ability to do is drag and drop data binding. So I'll add a new Windows form. And then I could come into the data sources window, and let's say I want to make a form with supplier information. I can just drag supplier from the data sources window onto the form, and now I would have a form that shows me supplier information, and it is bound to the object model, and therefore it's going to get information out of the supplier table in the Northwind database into the form. I'll close that down because I don't really want that table. Let's go back and look at the customer's form. After I drag these controls on, I still need to write some code, and in the load, I have to basically retrieve my information. I basically have to retrieve my data. Now, the first time I did this, I wrote code like this. This dot customer binding source dot data source. I set it equal to customers from the data context. So create a new instance of the data context and set the data source of the customer binding source to customers. And now, when I run this, notice that the customers appear. And as I scroll from customer to customer, I can see the orders for that customer. And let's see what's happening. Let's call up SQL Profiler. And let's start a new trace on the SQL Express database. I'm actually going to close this and then go back in. And let's see what happens. Well, up here, here's the SQL statement that retrieves the customers. And then that information gets displayed in the form. And also in here we go. Here's the SQL statement to retrieve the orders for this current customer, Alfkey. And then as I scroll to the next customer, the application sends a select statement to the SQL server to get the orders for that customer. So every time I scroll from customer to customer, I'm going to send a new statement to the SQL database to get the orders for that customer. And that's deferred loading. It's often called lazy loading. Those terms are the same. Basically means you get the related information when you need it. Now, I then decided that I really don't want all of the customers to appear when I call up the form. What I'd really like to do is give the user the ability to select some of the customers. So what I did was I got rid of that and I changed this code to this. First, I put a combo box on the form called countries combo box, and then I wanted to fill that with countries where we have customers. So I use a LINQ to SQL query for that. Go into the customers table, bring back customers, bring back the country, and then I added distinct on that because I only wanted a list of countries. And then I added that to the countries combo box. And so now when I run the form, no data appears yet, but I do get a list of countries that I can select from. And when I select a country, I'm going to run another query to bring back from the customers table all of the customers in that country. So where customer.country is equal countries combo box.selected item.toString. And then I set the data source of the customer binding source to customers, which is the results of that query. So because this query brings back essentially data rows, I can bind to the results of that query. Then I want to get the order summary for that customer. How do I know what customer I'm on? Well, customer binding source.current represents the customer I'm currently looking at. I cast that to an instance of customer, and that's the current customer. And now I can run a query based on that. So I want to bring down the number of orders for that customer. So go into orders, bring back the orders where order.customer equals current customer. Remember, the order class has a customer property that is an instance of the customer entity class. And specifically, it is the customer that owns the order. So if I get all the instances of the orders class where order.customer is equal to current customer, that will show me the orders for this customer. Then I get a count of that. If that count's greater than 0, then I go into the order details table, and where detail.order.customer is equal to current customer, add up price times quantity, and that's the value of orders. And then display that in the order summary label. And I'm only going to run that query if this customer actually has any orders. So now, when I run this, I select a country, and I'm then going to get the customers in that country. The SQL statement that gets sent is in here somewhere. There it is. So here's the first SQL statement that gets sent. Bring me back all the customers in Canada. Then show me the orders for the first customer in the list. Get the number of orders. Get the value of the orders. Again, as I scroll from customer to customer, I'm going to go get the orders for that customer. I can also change information here. So let's say these guys move next door to 45 Rue Saint-Laurent. I will save this. The changes were saved. Now let's go see the code for that. Let's go back in here, and when I save, I'm going to validate, call endEdit on the customer's binding source, and then submit changes. And what that will do is save that information for this customer. I can add an order. When I click Add Order, that brings up the new order form, and I'm going to pre-populate this with information from that customer. So I'm going to display the name of the customer and also fill out the shipping information and base that on the customer's information. Let's see how I did that. Go back into the customer form, and here's Add Order. When I do that, again, I'm going to get a reference to the current customer, and then I'm going to call the new order form, and I'm going to pass to it the customer ID. This new order form has a property for the customer ID. And then in the load, I'm going to get a reference to this customer. Current customer equals customers.single, and then pass in customer ID equals this customer ID. Now I could have just passed the customer instance itself. That's an alternative way to do this. But here I'm actually refreshing the data context and getting the most recent information for the customer. I suppose either technique would work just fine. And then I grab the company name, address, etc. information out of the current customer and pre-populate the ship name, ship address, etc. When I save, I create a new instance of the order class, populate it with the information for that order, add it to the collection of orders belonging to that customer, and submit changes. So again, let's pick a customer, add an order. ID 3, ship via 3, and freight of 40. And then while we're in here, let's test out the data validation. I'm going to set the order date to 2 days ago. When I try and save this, the validation kicks in. The order date can't be before today. Okay, we'll set the order date to today, but the required date to 3 days ago, that's not going to work either. And only if I set this correctly and now save this, now the order was added, and it is down here. Well, now this is an existing order, so let's try and change the order date to a few days ago. Now when I try and save this, an exception is thrown, can't change the order date of an existing order. And I suppose if I want to be nice to the users, maybe I should wrap this in a try-catch and put up a more user-friendly message. But on the other hand, a user gets this message, they're not going to try and change the order date on existing orders anymore, are they? Let's see products. I can view the orders for an existing product by clicking the Orders button. Let's go see that. So here are the products bound to the data context.products. And when I click for orders, I'm going to start a new instance of the product orders form and set 2 properties of that, the product ID and the product name. And then in the load, I'm going to run a query. I want to get the orders for this product. So I need to do a join between orders and details because the product is in the order details table and the rest of the information is in the orders table. So I'm using a join here. And I then set the data source of the grid to the results of that query. And then I also have data validation on product. So if we decide nobody likes this product, we're going to give it away. Now when I try and save, well, that's interesting. The Save button says the information was saved, but it's not because the unit price has to be greater than 0. Interesting. There we go. Now the changes really were saved. I guess that's a slight anomaly with the application, but the good news is that the data is correct. So that gives you a good idea of how you can take the LINQ to SQL techniques that you've seen in this and the previous section and apply them in a Windows application. Next, let's look at a web application. So I'll open up LINQ to SQL Web Demo. And this is a lot of the same techniques, but now in a web application instead. So in the LINQ to SQL Web Demo solution, I have 2 projects. LINQ to SQL Web Demo is my web application, and Data Layer has my object model and my data validation. I'm pretty sure this is exactly the same data validation as in the Windows application. Yep, and the same object model. So data layer is the same. The difference is going to be the front end, in this case, a web application. So I have 2 pages, one for customers and one for products. Let's look at the customers page. And here I want to show customers and orders. So I've got customers in the top grid, and I'm going to show orders in the bottom grid. And I also want to show customers in a particular country. So to do this, the first thing I added to this form was a LINQ data source. The LINQ data source is obviously new in ASP.NET 3.5, and it works similarly to the SQL data source, the object data source that you've probably used before. So I drag a LINQ data source onto the page, and I configure the data source. I specify the data context, which is datalayer.northwinddataContext. I specify the table I want to work with. Actually, let's get a little bit more clever about this. Let's create a new page for this. Add new item. Let's call this suppliers. Okay, now I'm going to add a new LINQ data source. I'm going to configure this data source. The context is Northwind data context in the data layer project. Okay, let's choose suppliers. I can select a where clause if I want in here. I can order by. And I can also specify whether or not I want data entry in here. So let's say yes to insert, update, and delete. Now when we finish, there's the LINQ data source. And so now I could add a grid to here, select LINQ data source as the data source, enable editing, deleting, selection, etc. Then let's just run this. There it is. And here's suppliers. I can edit, I can delete, I can select. So that is, at the high level, the basics of how I put together both the customers and the products pages. I have two LINQ data sources on here, one called customers, one called countries, and I have a combo box which is going to show countries, and I want the user to be able to select a country and then display in the grid the customers in that country. So the first thing I need to do is populate this combo box with countries. And I'm going to do that by using the LINQ data source. But I'm going to be a little bit clever about it, because what I really want is just the countries. Now if I configure a data source, so let's drag a new data source on here. When I configure it, I don't really have the ability to craft my own custom LINQ queries in here. So what I did for this instead was go into Properties and go into the Events. I created a selecting event. So in Countries LINQ data source selecting, I put my query. Bring me back customers from the customers table, actually bring me back the countries, distinct, and put that in this query. So now countries represents just a list of the countries. And then when I set e.result to that, that winds up being the data that is in the LINQ data source. So LINQ data source select event args has a result property, and I set that to the results of my query, and now this data source has brought back those query results. Then what I did on the drop-down list was I chose my data source and I set it to countries LINQ data source. And I said show country, and when somebody selects, that's country. So the first thing that happens when this form starts up is I retrieve the list of countries and I put it in this drop-down list. Then this data source, customers LINQ data source, is configured to show me all of the customers where country equals country that comes from the drop-down list. So this LINQ data source has a where clause, basically bring me back all the customers who are in the country that the user selected from the drop-down list. And then the grid here here it is. I choose my data source, customers LINQ data source, and I enable paging, sorting, and selection. So what happens when I run this, and let's check out what happens in the SQL profiler. Here it is. Select distinct country from customers. So that query runs. I then select a customer, Argentina by default, and I see the customers in Argentina. If I select a different country, say Finland, then I'll see the customers in Finland. Okay, what else is happening here? If I select this customer, then I want to see the orders for that customer. How many orders did they place? What was the total? And then show me each of the orders. So let's see how that works. Let's go back in here. When I select something from the grid, I'm going to show the orders grid, and I'm going to run LINQ queries. And these are the exact same LINQ queries that we just saw in the Windows application. Number of orders for this customer, total value of orders, and then display those in the summary label right here. And again, we're going to run queries to retrieve that information. Now I can edit, so I'll click Edit. And remember that one of our rules is that you can't change the order date of an existing order. So if I try and change this to 7/20/1996 and update, then I'm going to display this error message, and it's not going to work. When I cancel, the error message goes away. So that's done. In here, I'm using two events. I've got the row updated event for the grid. If there's no exception, if there is an exception, and that exception is going to be thrown because of the invalid data, then I'm going to display that exception in the error message. And I'm also going to indicate to ASP.NET that I'm handling the exception. And keep in edit mode, because I want the user to be able to change the data back. If the user cancels, then I clear out the message. I also have a products page on here. And here are the data sources. I've got products, I've got suppliers, I've got categories, and the reason I have three of those is because when the user edits, I want to show the categories in this drop-down list and the suppliers in this drop-down list. Okay, now when I select a product, I want to see the orders. So if I click View Orders, here are the orders for that product. So let's just take a quick look at the code in here, see if there's anything new and interesting. So when I click View Orders, if something's selected from the grid, then I'm going to run this query. It's the product orders query. This is a very similar query to what we saw in the Windows application for product ID equals the ID of the product selected in the grid, go get order information, and then show that in the grid. And then again, I've got validation going on for products to make sure that I don't set the price to 0 or below. So that gives you a good idea of how you can apply the LINQ to SQL techniques you've learned to a web application.